First, I'd like to thank the Prime Minister for enlisting our firm to both design and advise on the new wampum belt for the Royal Proclamation 2021. I want to acknowledge that we as a firm have good context on Indigenous legal orders since we've been given the opportunity to take a course by the University of Windsor. However, not many Indigenous people within their own communities have access to this knowledge. Secondly, I'd like to stress that this wampum belt is designed from the standpoint of a Western context. In order to get a full idea of what wampum belts signify, we highly recommended the Prime Minister he go and talk to elders within Indigenous communities. With that said, in order to understand our design of the wampum, you have to understand the history of wampum. So a large misconception about Indigenous law is that it is exclusively oral. It is true that Indigenous law and knowledge is taught and conceptualized through storytelling. However, wampum belts serve as a means of preserving this law in a form of written document. Symbols put into the belt signify lasting promises and ideas which are just as legally binding as Western law. Thus, our firm must stress to the Prime Minister that in the creation and presentation of a wampum belt, you are making a treaty and promise with Indigenous communities, which is both legal and sacred. The belt design our firm has provided you is laden with history of past promises to Indigenous communities. The belt is loosely based on the 1613 two-row wampum, which is symbolic of the first agreement between Ogowinhawa and Europeans. In the 1613 wampum, two parallel lines represent both Indigenous and European communities. Neither line outdoes the other. Both lines are prosperous while remaining independent as long as the grass grows, the rivers flow, and the sun shines everlasting. In the 1613 belt, a white background symbolizes purity, good faith, and peace. In other wampum designs, the color purple has signified conflict and violence. It is with this conflict in mind that the first symbol in our wampum belt design is two jagged lines which move to encroach on the other. The first symbol signifies a violent clash of worldviews between Indigenous culture and Western culture brought on by the colonization of Indigenous communities. More specifically, the colonization of Indigenous communities, which is justified by the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery includes all policies, doctrines, or practices which advocate the superiority of one people over another. It is important when viewing the symbol that the Prime Minister understands just how violent that conflict is. There are many instances of horrific violence undertaken by European settlers, but our firm has chosen to give you a specific example. On the island of Hispaniola in 1552, Bartolome de las Casas provides an account of Christians committing genocide against the Indian population. The Christians would spare neither child nor pregnant woman. They made bets on who would murder more violently. They made a gallows, and in the name of Jesus burned Indians alive. Finally, they cut off their hands and fastened letters to their bodies, hoping the news would carry to those who had run into the mountains. Although this account is not historically located in Canada, it is important to textualize the vast decline of Indigenous peoples since the arrival of European settlers. The decline is at a rate of over 95%. This type of violent, abhorrent genocide is universal in its scope and was committed historically in Canada as well. The jagged purple lines of the wampum signify a recognition and ownership of this historical violence to Indigenous communities. Yet to recognize historical violence against Indigenous communities is not enough. The second symbol of the wampum, a Canadian maple leaf, is meant to show that the doctrine of discovery is still alive in Canada today. Notice that the jagged lines of the first symbol converge to make Canada. This serves two purposes. The first is to acknowledge Indigenous contribution to the creation of Canada's Constitution. Hundreds of treaties between Indigenous communities and European settlers underlie the structure of our laws. Secondly, the maple leaf signifies the doctrine of discovery, still alive in Canada, and the oppression of Indigenous people. Thus, the Indigenous line is no longer parallel, but becomes hidden under the veil of the Canadian maple leaf. There is substantial proof that Canada is still acting within the ideology of the doctrine of discovery. For instance, the Indian Act, enacted in 1876, was a codification of Indigenous laws that worked towards assimilating Indigenous people into Western civilization. Among other things, the Act denied Indigenous women status, introduced residential schools, created reserves, as well as band councils, and denied Indigenous the right to vote. The discovery of the remains of Indigenous children at the location of many of these residential schools is testimony to the implications that the Act still has on Indigenous communities today. Another example is that Indigenous people are grossly overrepresented within the criminal justice system. The Canadian Indigenous population represents about 5% of our population. However, they now represent 30% of the federally incarcerated population. Furthermore, implementations such as the Gladue principles have been failed attempts at dealing with this problem. Instead, they serve more as a shield which hides the accountability of Western institutions. In fact, there is no guarantee that Indigenous peoples will have their case heard in Western courts. The judge's decision to bar Schuyler Williams from a court in his fight for land back land in 2021 attests to this fact. If the Prime Minister is serious about reconciliation, there must be acknowledgement of what the Canadian maple leaf truly symbolizes, the contemporary remnants of the doctrine of discovery. The third symbol of the wampum is a sacred pipe, which represents the recognition of Indigenous sacred law. Specifically, the pipe is representing the 7 pipe laws, including health, happiness, generosity, generations, quietness, compassion, and respect. Although it is important to recognize that Indigenous communities are separate and autonomous in their own contexts, there are some commonalities which can represent the ideals of Indigenous people. The 7 pipe laws are one example of an underlying moral structure to Indigenous laws and ways of life. Indigenous laws are commonly separated into 4 categories: human laws, earth laws, spiritual laws, and animal laws. These laws, which are given by the Creator, are part of the fabric of reality. They are internally embedded in both Indigenous people and the earth itself. Thus, it is counterintuitive to Indigenous sacred law that it be written in a codified system as the Canadian Constitution is. For Indigenous community, law is lived, not dictated. This is important when viewing reconciliation for 2 primary reasons. The first is recognizing that Indigenous law is a binding system of knowledge which must be followed. A common misconception about Indigenous communities is that they are lawless. This could not be farther from the truth. Indigenous people act in the manner bestowed upon them by the Creator. This could be the need to protect the environment from regulated dumping, or to build a home for a fellow community member who has lost it. The second is recognizing that Canadian forms of law often erect barriers which fully inhibit the practice of Indigenous law. Many Indigenous protests are spurred by Indigenous law. The protests on Land Back Lane, for instance, are protests which are not only justified but required in order to protect the land given to Indigenous communities by their Creator in Indigenous contexts. However, the intervention of police and Western courts inhibits that practice. In order to reach reconciliation, the Canadian government must realize both the nature and validity of Indigenous laws and work to uphold the values behind them. Finally, symbol 4 of the wampum seeks to reach harmony between Indigenous communities and Canadians. As with the Belt of 1613, the 2 parallel lines signify the prospering independence of both cultures. However, instead of the lines being purple as with the first belt, this wampum has the lines white, which signify good faith, honesty, and peace between both communities. Our firm wants to make clear to the Prime Minister that this outcome can only be realized if his government approaches reconciliation with those ideals. Of primary importance is the government's commitment to prior promises made to Indigenous communities. One of these treaties is Treaty 6, which was signed between 1871 and 1877. The treaty includes important terms, such as on-reserve education, which have not been followed. The government's refusal to pay money to Indigenous children, for instance, stands as a stain on good faith and reconciliation. Our firm highly recommends that the Prime Minister upholds promises. Without doing so, reconciliation cannot be reached. Our firm also wants to encourage the government to shift its ideals to one which is based on reciprocity, not the doctrine of discovery. The approach focuses on both the difference and authenticity of separate knowledge systems, while emphasizing a two-way process in which knowledge flows back and forth among community members and experts. This shift is necessary to ensure the government exhibits core values such as respect, responsibility, reciprocity, and relevance as we continue the relationship with Indigenous communities. Going forward with the new Royal Proclamation, our firm sincerely hopes the Canadian government will consider the meaning held within the Wampum Belt and ensure reconciliation is founded on peace and good faith, as long as the grass grows, the river flows, and the sun shines everlasting.